In Victorian London, there was a way to find out whether a young woman worked in a match factory. You did not ask her. You waited until nightfall. Then you took her into a room with no lamp, and you closed the door, and you watched her face, and if she was one of them, by the accounts of the time, you would see it. A faint, greenish-white light glowing from inside her jaw, cold, steady, shining through the skin like something buried alive. She was not cursed, she was not diseased in any way the poor of London understood. She was simply dipping wooden sticks, 10 hours a day, into a paste that was slowly dissolving the bones of her face. By the 1890s, the human race was making, by some estimates, 3 trillion matches every single year. 3 trillion. Not machines doing it alone. Hands. Mostly the hands of girls, some of them 13 years old, in factories from London to Vienna to Boston. And here is the thing worth understanding before we go any further. That little wooden stick was not a convenience. It was one of the most important objects ever placed in a human hand. Because before it existed, fire was not something you made, it was something you kept, and something you begged from a neighbor when you lost it. So here is the question this video answers. How did a piece of wood, the length of your finger, transform daily life for every human being on Earth, build industrial fortunes, and eat the faces of the people who made it, all in the space of a single lifetime? To answer that, we have to go back to a world without it. A cold house, on a black morning, in the year 1800. Imagine waking before dawn in a house with no fire. There is no switch, there is no lighter in a drawer, there is no gas, no electricity, and the embers you buried in the hearth last night have gone cold. You need flame, for warmth, for cooking, for light, for absolutely everything, and you must now make it from nothing with your hands. So you reach for the tinderbox. Inside is a piece of flint, a curved strip of steel, and a nest of tinder, scorched linen, dried moss, whatever will catch. You strike the steel against the stone. A spark leaps and dies. You strike again and again. In damp weather, in a cold English winter, you might strike 30 times, 50 times, 100, before a single spark takes hold in the tinder and begins to smoke. Then you must nurse that smoke into a flame without breathing on it too hard, and coax the flame onto a splint of wood dipped in sulfur, and carry that flame to the hearth before it dies in your fingers. By many accounts, the whole business could take half an hour. Half an hour, every morning, before anything else in the day could begin. Which is why, for most of human history, people did not make fire, they hoarded it. The hearth was banked at night, so the embers survived until morning. Households kept fire burning for years without letting it go out entirely. If yours died, you took a shovel or a covered pot and walked to a neighbor's house to borrow flame, the way you might borrow a cup of sugar. There is a word still in the language that remembers all this: curfew. It comes from the old French couvre-feu, cover the fire. In medieval towns, a bell rang at nightfall, and at that signal, every household was required to damp down or cover its hearth, because a town built of timber could not survive one careless ember. The word now means a rule about when you must be indoors. It began as a rule about fire, because fire, in a world without matches, was both the most valuable thing in the house and the most dangerous. Fire was the household's most precious possession and the most fragile. It could be lost, and losing it meant a cold day, a raw meal, and a humiliating walk down the road. That was the ordinary human condition, not for a century, for every century, everywhere, since the beginning. And then, In a small chemist's shop in the north of England, a man mixing a paste for an entirely different purpose scraped his stirring stick against the hearthstone, and the stick caught fire. The man was John Walker, a chemist and druggist in Stockton-on-Tees, in County Durham. The year was 1826. Walker had been working on an experimental firing paste, mixing antimony sulfide, potassium chlorate, gum, and starch. When he scraped the coated end of his mixing stick along the stone to clean it, it burst into flame. And Walker, unlike most people who witness an accident, understood immediately what he was looking at. He began selling them the following spring: cardboard strips, then wooden splints, tipped with his paste, sold in a box of 50 with a folded piece of sandpaper to drag them through. He called them Congreves, after the rocket pioneer of the day. A box cost £1, real money for a working family, but set against half an hour of striking flint every morning, it was a bargain beyond argument. And then John Walker made the single worst business decision in the history of fire. He was advised to patent his invention. For reasons no one has ever fully explained, he declined. Within 3 years, a London chemist named Samuel Jones was selling his own version under a name that stuck to the whole category for a generation: Lucifer's. Walker himself never grew rich from it. He kept his shop, sold his Congreves to the people of his own town, and died in 1859, by which time the thing he had invented was being manufactured by the million across Europe, under other men's names, in other men's factories. The man who ended the half hour before dawn is not today a household name anywhere outside County Durham. But the true transformation came from Paris. In 1830, a poor young French chemistry student named Charles Soria, say it Soria, took Walker's formula and swapped one ingredient. Out went the antimony sulfide. In went white phosphorus. The result was extraordinary. The new match lit almost instantly, on almost any rough surface, with far less smell and far less drama. It was reliable in a way Walker's never had been. It was the strike anywhere match, essentially the match your grandparents would have recognized. Soria, being poor, never secured the patent either. He died in 1895 with almost nothing. And by the time he did, the invention he had given away was being manufactured at a scale almost impossible to picture. Factories across Europe and America, millions of boxes a week, match sellers on every city corner. That figure again, 3 trillion matches a year, worldwide. Yet, it came with hazards that had nothing to do with the factories. White phosphorus matches were unstable. They could ignite from friction alone, in a pocket, in a cart, under the feet of a rat gnawing at a box in a storeroom. House fires traced to loose matches became common enough that manufacturers began treating the wooden splints with fire retardant, so the stick would not keep burning down to a careless finger. They were also, simply, poison. The head of a single match carried enough white phosphorus to kill a small child who chewed it, and accidental poisonings of children were a recognized danger of the Victorian household. Fire had gone from a possession to a purchase, from something you guarded for years to something you struck, used for 11 seconds, and dropped on the ground without a thought. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the great liberations of ordinary life. There was only one difficulty: the ingredient that made it all possible, that beautiful, obliging white phosphorus, was one of the most vicious industrial poisons ever put into the hands of a 13-year-old girl. Here is what it actually did, and it is worth being precise, because precision is the whole point. White phosphorus gives off vapor, especially when warmed. In the dipping rooms of a match factory, The paste sat in heated vats, and the air above those vats was thick with it. The workers breathed that air for 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours a day. They also ate their meals in the same room, because there was nowhere else to go. The vapor attacked the jaw. It usually began with what seemed like nothing at all, a toothache. Then the gums began to swell and ache. Then abscesses formed, and the teeth loosened and fell out. Then the jawbone itself began to die inside the face. That dead bone did not simply vanish, it rotted in place. Openings formed through the cheek that would not close and drained continuously, and the smell was so severe that sufferers were often shunned in their own homes. In the worst cases, the whole side of the face darkened, and the bone had to be cut away by a surgeon, leaving a young woman without a lower jaw. And in the dark, before it was removed, the dying bone glowed. These were not, for the most part, grown women. The workforce of a match factory was built out of teenagers, girls of 13, 14, 15, chosen because their hands were quick and their wages could be set lower than a man's. They stood at the frames, dipped the splints, and breathed the warm air off the vats, year after year, at the exact age when the bones of the face are still finishing their growth. They called it phossy jaw, phosphorus necrosis of the jaw, and around 1 in 5 of the people who developed it died of it. Now, the part that turns a tragedy into a story about power. None of this was a mystery. None of it was newly discovered. Reports of phossy jaw had been circulating across Europe since the 1840s. In 1852, Charles Dickens himself published an article about the condition, describing the destruction of the teeth and jaws of young factory workers. He called it one of the evils of matchmaking. So by the time the great London match houses were at their peak, the disease had been documented for roughly 40 years, in medical journals, in the popular press, by the most famous writer in the English language. It was not a secret, it was a cost, an accepted, calculated, budgeted cost of doing business. Everyone in the industry understood what white phosphorus did to a human face, and everyone in the industry kept buying it because it was cheaper than the alternative, and because the alternative made a match that did not strike anywhere. Which brings us to a factory in the East End of London, and to 1,400 women and girls who had finally had enough. The Bryant and May Match Factory opened in Bow, in East London, in 1861, and when it opened, it did the decent thing. It used red phosphorus, the safe kind, which does not cause necrosis, to make safety matches. But safety matches only strike on the side of their own box. Customers wanted the other kind, the kind you could strike on a wall, a boot, a fence post. So the company switched to white phosphorus, and the money followed, and the disease followed the money. By the 1880s, Bryant and May employed around 1,400 women and girls. Here is what a shift looked like. Workdays running up to 14 hours. Wages so low that a girl might take home a few shillings a week. And out of that, a system of fines that today reads like something invented for a novel. You were fined for talking, fined for dropping matches, fined for going to the toilet without permission, fined for having dirty feet or an untidy bench. If a girl's tray of matches caught fire, which happened because she was working with fire, she was fined for the damage. There was nowhere clean to eat, so they ate at the benches, in the phosphorus air. And the company's response to phossy jaw was a policy of astonishing simplicity. If a worker complained of toothache, she was told to have the teeth pulled out immediately. If she refused, she was dismissed. Understand what that means. The company knew exactly what the early sign of the disease was. It had a procedure for it. And the procedure was not to change the chemical, or to ventilate the room, or to compensate the worker. The procedure was to remove the evidence from her mouth and send her back to the bench. Meanwhile, in the same years, the shareholders of Bryant and May were receiving dividends of over 20%. 20%, paid out of the same rooms where teenage girls were losing their jaws. And the factory floor was only half of it. The boxes themselves were assembled somewhere else entirely, in the homes of the poor, across the East End, by women and children working at kitchen tables. They were paid by the gross, a little over 2p for 144 finished boxes, out of which the worker often had to supply her own paste and string. A family working most of the day and much of the evening might produce a few gross. Children folded boxes before school and after it. So the object cost almost nothing in the shop for a reason. The price had been pushed, link by link, down the chain, until it came to rest on the smallest and least powerful hands available. In the summer of 1888, a socialist campaigner and journalist named Annie Besant, say it B-E-Z-ant, stood outside the factory gates and did something no one in a position of power had bothered to do in 40 years. She asked the girls what it was like. What she heard, she printed. On the 23rd of June, 1888, in her halfpenny weekly paper, The Link, Annie Besant published an article under a title designed to make comfortable readers choke on their breakfast, White Slavery in London. It laid out the hours, the wages, the fines, the disease, and set them directly beside those 20% dividends. Bryant and May's response was a masterclass in how not to handle a scandal. The company threatened Besant with legal action. Then it went to its own workers and demanded that they sign a paper denying everything she had written. The girls refused, every one of them. So the company picked one of them and dismissed her on an unrelated pretext at the beginning of July. It was meant as a warning to the rest. It was the worst miscalculation in the company's history. Within a day, around 1,400 women and girls had walked out of the factory. These were girls with almost nothing, no union worth the name, no savings. Most of them were a week's wages from hunger at the best of times. No legal protection, no vote, and no expectation of sympathy from a society that regarded them as the lowest form of labor in London. Their assets came to this: a strike committee, a story that was now in print, and the sheer public spectacle of 1,400 young women standing in the street outside a factory that made an object in every home in Britain. The national press picked it up. Members of Parliament took an interest. The London Trades Council backed them. Money came in from strangers. And on the 17th of July, 1888, 12 days after the walkout began, the directors of Bryant and May surrendered. Every demand met, the fines abolished, the deductions ended, grievances to be brought directly to management rather than through the foreman. A room where the workers could eat their meals away from the phosphorus. 12 days, 1,400 girls with no money and no power had taken one of the most profitable companies in London and beaten it in 12 days. And they did not simply go back to work and forget it. Out of the strike came a formal organization, a union of women matchmakers, which for a time was the largest union of women and girls in the country. Workers whom every respectable authority had written off as unorganizable had organized, won, and then built the machinery to do it again. The Matchgirls' strike is now remembered as one of the founding events of modern trade unionism, the moment unskilled workers discovered they could organize and win. But read the list of what they actually won, and something is missing from it. Something enormous. What they had won was better pay and dignity and a clean room to eat in. They had not won the removal of the poison. White phosphorus remained perfectly legal in Britain. The dipping rooms stayed exactly as they were, and the reason given by the British government, when pressed to ban it, deserves to be quoted for as long as anyone studies this period. A ban, they argued, would be an unacceptable restraint of free trade. This was not a fringe position. Finland had already prohibited white phosphorus in 1872, Denmark in 1874. Sweden had moved against it. The technology existed. Red phosphorus safety matches had been on the market for decades. The problem was never that no one knew how to make a safe match. The problem was that safe matches cost more, and customers preferred a match that struck on a wall. So into that gap stepped a rather unlikely industrialist, an aging preacher named William Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army. In 1890, Booth had published a book about British poverty called In Darkest England and the Way Out. In 1891, he did something considerably more interesting than write another one. He bought a derelict factory in Old Ford, just north of Bow, walking distance from Bryant and May, and went into the match business himself. Booth's factory used only red phosphorus. He installed proper ventilation. He paid roughly double the going rate for the work. The boxes went out under the brand name Lights in Darkest England, and they were printed with slogans: fair wages for fair work, explaining to the customer exactly why this box cost more than the other box. And then Booth did the cleverest thing of all. He invited members of Parliament and journalists to tour his clean, bright, well-ventilated factory. And then he took the same people to see the homes of the workers who made matches for his competitors. It is, as far as these things go, one of the earliest examples of ethical consumerism. A product sold on the argument that the cheaper version has a hidden price, and that the buyer is paying it whether they look at it or not. Booth's factory was never commercially successful. It could not compete with mass production, and it closed by 1901. But it had made the argument impossible to ignore. The competitors felt the moral pressure, and then the financial pressure, and the use of white phosphorus in Britain began to fall. The final blow, though, would not come from a preacher or a journalist or 1,400 striking girls. It would come from a conference room in Switzerland. On the 26th of September, 1906, in the Swiss city of Bern, an international treaty was signed with one of the least dramatic titles ever attached to a document of this significance: the International Convention respecting the prohibition of the use of white phosphorus in the manufacture of matches. It banned the stuff, not just its use, its import and its sale as well. Britain passed its own law in 1908. The United States took a different route. Rather than ban white phosphorus outright, Congress taxed it so punishingly that production simply stopped, and by 1913 it was finished. In 1910, the Diamond Match Company patented a genuinely safe formula, and then, under public pressure, made it available to its competitors. 80 years after the first Lucifer was sold, the poison was gone. So count the cost of that 80 years. 4 decades of documented medical evidence, ignored. An article by Dickens, ignored. A strike by 1,400 girls that made national news, which won them wages and dignity, and did not remove the poison. A rival factory built by a preacher to prove it could be done safely, which went out of business. And finally, only when nation after nation had agreed together that no single country would lose a competitive advantage by acting, a treaty. That is the pattern. It was never a mystery to be solved. It was a price somebody else was paying, and it stopped when it became expensive to keep paying it. Now go and open the drawer in your kitchen. There is almost certainly a box of matches in there, behind the batteries, under the takeaway menus. They cost you almost nothing. You will not think about them once this year. That box is one of the most consequential objects human beings have ever made. It ended the half hour before dawn. It took fire, the thing our species guarded above all else for 100,000 years, and made it disposable. And for 80 years, the light in that box was paid for by the bones of teenage girls in East London, whose faces glowed in the dark. Strike one tonight and watch the flame. It is a very old bargain, and somebody has already settled the bill. If you found this worth your time, subscribe. There is a new one every week, and the next object in the drawer has a story just as strange. And tell me in the comments, which everyday object do you think has the darkest history of all? I read every one.